Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to go over the preamble to the Constitution. So the preamble, of course, is what is on the screen right here. So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we have to remember that the Articles of Confederation was our existing form of government. We created a convention to try to revise those articles, and then decided to throw out the entire Articles of Confederation and start over again. Well, when we finished with this new document, which we are going to call the Constitution, we needed to introduce it to the people at large and to basically try to persuade them that this was going to be a better solution than what they were currently under. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion. If you look at the chapter that you're supposed to be reading, you'll see that there was lots of ratification debates. A lot of people liked it. A lot of people did not. Some of our big names, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, were all part of its creation. But there were a lot of big names such as Jefferson, Adams, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, that just weren't there to give input. So we had to introduce it to them in a way to try to get them to understand what we were trying to accomplish. Hence the preamble. Not written by Madison, not written by Washington, technically speaking, not even part of the Constitution itself. It is the pre of the Constitution, the preamble. So it is sort of a mission statement. It is the Twitter version of the Constitution. The one that if you are not going to read the whole thing, and odds are we're not going to, then at least if we read the first paragraph, we'd get an idea of what they're trying to accomplish in this. So the way we are going to look at this lecture today is we are going to look at the preamble. We're going to break it down like the stuff on the board over there. And then what we're going to do is try to contrast what the Constitution is going to give us with what were the problems before the Constitution. Because that's sort of what he's trying to say here. He's trying to say these are the changes. These are the fixes that this document will give us. And that's why we need to move ahead and approve this Constitution. Now today, it's the cool thing that me as a first grader had to memorize for some unknown reason. And maybe you have had to as well. But overall, it is probably the only part of the Constitution a lot of people know, besides the general idea of, well, it talks about the government and it talks about the president and the Congress and the Supreme Court, but they know a little bit about this. So where does it come from? Well, it was written towards the end of the convention, actually almost as an afterthought, where they decided they needed some kind of introduction. So it was written by a man by the name of Gouverneur Morris. Not governor, Gouverneur. Yeah, I don't know if his parents hated him or not. Gouverneur is an interesting character because he's not really that famous. He pops up in history just at a brief moment in time, which is the American Revolution, through this part of the Constitution, but really nothing afterwards. And he's quite interesting because, like FDR, he suffered from a disability. Now, he didn't have polio, or he might have had smallpox. Odds are he had smallpox of some form, but it was probably inoculation-wise. But he did have a disability. When he was younger, he got in a carriage accident, and he lost his leg from the knee down. I think it was his right leg. It's either his left leg or his right leg. Someone should check up on that. He lost a leg in a carriage accident, and then around his 16th, when he was a teenager, a bunch of boiling hot water got spilled on him, and his entire right hand side of his body was basically deformed from probably third-degree burns. So he had some things to overcome. In the war, he served usually as finance person, trying to make sure that there was funding. He served in Congress, and this is his #1 contribution if we were to go back in time to look at what he did for us. And that was giving us this cool preamble, the lyrically flow of it. So he starts off the bat with "We the people of the United States." Now, before we get into what all that means, we first have to look at that this is a big departure. If we go to the Articles of Confederation, The Articles of Confederation is basically saying we, the states, are forming this country. We're a firm league of friendship, not amongst individuals, but among collectively these states. This is going to be different. They're going to change the social contract from being the states are entering into a social contract, creating a limited government, to the people are coming into creating a social contract to do this, okay? So when he says we the people of the United States, he is trying to proclaim that the authority of the Constitution that gives its legitimacy is from the people and not from anywhere else. It's also going to state, following this in the preamble, what the goals and purpose of the government is. Remember, it's a mission statement. But it doesn't actually grant the government any powers. It just explains what comes next and how it's going to relate to things we found lacking or things that we idealize or strive towards. Okay, so let's look at this first section here. We, the people of the United States. So once again, and so I sort of said it a minute ago, but we'll repeat it here. And I'll try to slow down. It's hard when I don't have people that I'm talking to slow my roll a little bit here. But that's what the questions are for, right? So we, the people of the United States, like I mentioned earlier, this is the big departure. The idea behind this is the idea of what's called popular sovereignty, which is the rule by the people. Now, we know we're not forming a direct democracy. We're going to be way too large for that. We're going to form a republic, which is, once again, if we forgot, an indirect democracy. But in this case, the indirect democracy is where people are remaining active and vigilant in making sure that the government is doing what they sent them to do, that our representatives are held accountable, and that people stay informed with what's going on. So we, the people of the United States, is that expression. All forms of political power, tongue twister, political power belong to the people, and that they are sovereign in giving up part of their sovereignty to do this. Very Locke sense, not a Hobbes sense, very Locke in nature, okay? And that it's based upon the people's consent. Now, if we were to compare this to the Articles, remember, the Articles were based on the states. The states were the paramount. It was, and I think it was the last day I was here, the United States of America, not the United States of America. There's a difference. The states were the expression of popular consent, the social contract that was created. And this changes the focus that it's the people and not the states. And that's why later in history, when we get to the Civil War, that's Lincoln's bedrock, that under the Articles, you're right, states were in there and they could leave at any time. But we're not under the Articles, we're under the Constitution. And the Constitution created a contract among people, not among states. States can't leave unless the entire system is destroyed. So let's go to the next one. In order to form a more perfect union. Yes, I know, more perfect. Shouldn't it just be in order to form a perfect union? How can something be more perfect than it already is? Well, this is Gouverneur Morris's idea, right? This really didn't have any debate. They just accepted it. Maybe everyone was tired. Maybe everyone decided, yeah, whatever, no one's going to read it anyways. But this was a way for Gouverneur Morris to sort of placate people. He's not admitting that the Articles is wrong. He's not admitting that the Articles are awful. He's saying, yes, the Articles are good. However, this is, or maybe they're perfect, but this is going to be more perfect. I know it's splitting hairs, but that's essentially why it says more perfect and not just a perfect union. Now, what is the point of that? Well, we all recognize that the Articles weren't working. Shays' Rebellion demonstrated that when push came to shove, the national government couldn't do anything to promote internal harmony or protect us from external threats. It had no way to compel states to get along with each other, and it had no way to enforce the laws or interpret the laws so that there wasn't confusion. which is why we need to change. Now, under the Constitution, we are going to create branches of government. We're going to create a more perfect union, right? We're going to create branches of government so that the government can enforce itself, can compel states to do things. We solve this also by saying that what's called the supremacy clause. Let me type that up here, because I didn't write that down. Supremacy clause. Okay, the supremacy clause. It sounds simple, and you're going to be doing a little bit more about this in another lesson. But the supremacy clause just essentially says that we're going to put an order to things. The Constitution is going to be the most supreme, the most supremist, then national laws, then state constitutions, then state laws. There's a hierarchy of things, and the Constitution is going to be put at the top of it. Not your state constitutions, this Constitution. So we're trying to promote unity. We're trying to tie everybody together. The supremacy clause, the branches of government, the ability to enforce itself are all ways we're going to make the Constitution a more perfect union, as opposed to the Articles, where the government couldn't do anything and couldn't hold us together. Establish justice. Just as we were creating a way to enforce things, we also needed to create a way to interpret things. So under the Articles of Confederation, there was no judicial branch. There was no way for the government to interpret what laws are or to create a uniform code where we didn't have conflicting laws depending upon what state you were in. So under established justice, we are going to create a judicial branch or a Supreme Court. I say branch, but it really just means the Supreme Court. The Constitution doesn't actually explain anything beyond a Supreme Court. Now, if you know anything about government, you'll know that there are other levels of federal courts, from district courts to courts of appeals, and all other specialized courts. And that comes from an act of Congress, because under the Constitution, it just says Supreme Court and other courts that may be authorized. The Congress is the one that authorized those. But it did establish the Supreme Court, someone that we could turn to for the final say in what a law means. Because we're always striving towards the goal of fairness, and we're always striving towards the goal of justice. And what this is going to ensure is that if the national government has the final say, that there's going to be equal treatment among its citizens. It didn't matter if you're from Pennsylvania or New York, you're going to be treated the same under the law. Now, this equality is equality of opportunity, not equality of condition. No one ever thought that everyone was going to be free and equal. Well, especially not here, because we know equality and freedom were very limited at the time. But even as it's brought forth in our history, and as we move closer to modern day, we see that we're really talking about the opportunity to be treated the same under the law, the opportunity to pursue happiness, as Jefferson would say, to acquire property, to maintain our natural rights, and that we can strive to do things that we'd like to do, as long as it doesn't violate the freedom of others. Next one. Ensure domestic tranquility. Another complicated, vague term, right? What we wanted to make sure is that domestic tranquility is that you will feel safe and secure in our country, domestically. That states won't disagree with each other and turn to violence. That internally, things are going to move fairly smoothly. And that there will be levels of government to ensure that that happens. How are we going to do this? Well, we first have to remember where we're coming from. The Articles of Confederation didn't have a way to ensure domestic tranquility. In fact, this statement is pointing to the major problem that caused the convention in the first place, which was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion had individual citizens rebelling against the state government it was from, and to a degree, the national government, all because of the bonds that were issued for fighting the American Revolution. Now, the national government, under the Articles, couldn't do anything about it. And so how are we going to ensure domestic tranquility? Well, we have to give the government the ability to do that. And so in the Constitution, the way we're going to ensure domestic tranquility is by giving the ability of giving the government the ability to call out the militia. The national government couldn't compel the militia to come out in the past. It had to rely on states. Under the Constitution, it can do that. If there are domestic insurrections, if there are natural disasters, the national government can bring out state militias. Today, we would call them the National Guard. But they can call them out to help and assist in those matters. In the lower levels, we've got police and fire, but that's not really what we're talking about here. It's really hard when we talk about and execute laws, we tend to go with the police officers, but it really means government agencies directing other agencies to do certain things. So in this manner, it's the national government compelling or saying, hey, based on my authority given to me by the Constitution, I am telling you, you need to activate the National Guard, and they need to respond to this crisis if you're not already doing it. And I can coordinate other states' National Guards to do and assist if I needed to. Laws are made to protect us, is what it's trying to say, and is meant to protect us from each other and from things that might pop up from time to time. Now, number 5, provide for the common defense. If domestic tranquility meant that we are going to help internally, common defense is externally. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no national army. There was no national military. It makes sense. The Articles of Confederation was a time when we are fighting in a war on an oppressive government that sent troops to enforce its order. The fear is, under the Articles of Confederation, that a national army would be used by the government to ensure compliance, martial law. We find that we have to trust each other at some point. And so when we write the Constitution, we have to give the government the ability to defend us from external threats. And the way to do that is through a professional army. Militia can only take us so far. A professional army can enable us to defend ourselves on a larger scale. So the Constitution is going to give the ability of the government to create an army and a navy. Now, there'll be a clause in our Constitution which will give it the ability to stretch that idea to new things, such as the Air Force and even the Marines, which originally developed from the Navy. If you don't know how, look it up sometime, but that's where it originated during our first ships and whatnot. So the common defense ensure peace in our borders from external threats. The national government will protect us from an attack because we also have a lot of enemies. To the south of us is Spain. To the north of us is the people we just beat in a war, Great Britain. To the west is technically France, but sometimes Spain. But who knows if they're always going to be our friends. There are pirates out in the ocean. We need to make sure that we can protect ourselves. And that's what the purpose of provide for the common defense is going to be for. Promote the general welfare. Now, this is an economics term. General welfare, it means the economic good of all. The ability to have the government ensure the economic conditions to allow us to thrive. The articles, once again, remember this thing is all about what do the articles do? How is this going to solve it? The articles didn't have the ability to do that. It had no way to fund itself, which is not always a bad thing, but it had no way to run government programs. Additionally, it had no way to pay off debt besides asking other states for money. And I don't know about you. Some of our friends, yeah, we could always ask for money and they'd always freely give it. But if you keep asking for money all the time, at some point they stop. Or at some point they don't give us as much as we are actually looking for. That's what was happening. In addition, there was no way for them to have a national currency. Every state had its own currency, and therefore there wasn't a standard medium of exchange. They didn't have the ability under the Articles of Confederation to coin money and to regulate its value. So under the Constitution, to protect the economic good of all, we're going to give the ability to regulate trade to the government. The ability to say, just because they have to go through Pennsylvania doesn't mean Pennsylvania can impact that trade. we call those imports and exports, right? Well, if you treat the states as individual entities and not one country, when a product leaves Maryland to go into Pennsylvania, that is technically exporting a country, something, and Pennsylvania is importing. Well, what's to stop them from abusing that and charging imports and exports? Well, the Constitution. Giving the national government the ability to regulate trade, giving the national government to regulate currency, was stabilize the economy and ensure that we would have a general welfare for all. Secure the blessings of liberty. That's the main struggle. The fear under the Articles of Confederation is that any other government, if we created, well, why we created the Articles to begin with, is to protect our liberty. We were afraid some oppressive government was going to come in and take over, that we'd create a new king, that we would do something to impact our current state. Gouverneur Morris wants to ensure that we understand, or that people, if they're just reading that the government that is going to be created here is securing the blessings of liberty. That is going to make sure that everyone has, I'm going to write that on here too, pink, pink, a representative government. Yes, we know how to spell it. We've talked about it many times. But we're going to make sure it's representative government. Or, in the Constitution, what they call it is a Republican form of government. Not a Republican in a sense of political party, but Republican in the sense of a republic. Those that are in favor of a educated populace that is represented through elected officials, but that are held accountable. And that's what a Republican form of government is. And they were just afraid under the Articles that that this government wasn't going to last. Everyone saw the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. Other countries saw the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. We were at each other's throats. No one respected us. No one thought that we were going to make it. How could 13 separate entities, which had independent streaks, do something collaboratively and connect to each other and give up something that they had just won, which was sovereignty in its own borders? But the Constitution is going to do that. It's going to say you don't have to worry about Great Britain coming back here and putting a king here. You're not going to have to worry about other countries trying to create royalty. We're never going to have a monarchy here. The Constitution is going to say that we will never give titles of nobility. There will never be an Earl of Cleveland or a Baron of Phoenix or I don't have anything, I'm sorry, a Princess of Anaheim. Although there are lots of princesses in Anaheim, they're technically not official titles. Or Disneyland exists in some kind of bubble that allows it as a sovereign independent entity. But they have limited jurisdiction, so I don't think we have to worry about it. But that's what Secure the Blessings of Liberty is for, is to make sure that we know that there will never be a monarch in the United States. Now that's the preamble. The last thing I want to do really quick is just explain what the rest of the Constitution is. We have the preamble at the beginning. Then we have the following things. So we have Article 1 is limiting the power of government. This is where we are creating, this is the longest article. If you look on the wall over there, you might see the Constitution somewhere. There should be hanging from the wall somewhere. But Article 1 is the longest. It explains what our government can and can't do, what is restricted from the government, what is allowed in the government. It also sets up what they thought was going to be the most important branch of government, which is the legislative branch. They thought that the legislative branch would be the ultimate authority in the United States. Now, to some degree, that's still the case. But in other degrees, we sort of look at the president. Why? My theory is that we look at the president because it's a lot easier to place responsibility or blame on one person than on the 435 in the House and the 100 people in the Senate that's found in Congress. How do you hold someone accountable? Sort of was the problem in the Constitutional Convention. They were originally debating on whether or not they were going to have, let's hold a second. Article 2 talks about the executive branch. It sets up one president. In the Constitutional Convention, there was lots of debate on whether it should be one person or many. And the argument ended up coming down to issues aren't black and white. If we want to exercise power, we sort of have to unite it. And so by having the executive have the power to execute things to make sure things are carried out, you need one person to be able to do that. If you split it up, things won't get done. They'll blame shift, they'll move it around, they'll get indecisiveness. If you have three people, it could be yes, no, maybe. What do you do then? So they decided on one executive. And that's Article 2, the executive branch. It's not as long as Article 1, but it's definitely longer than Article 3, which sets up the judicial branch. Up until like the 1940s, the Supreme Court didn't even have its own building. It met in Congress. It's been sort of the middle child, if you will, even though it's the third child, the youngest child, sort of the middle child of the government. It didn't really get the respect it deserved until much later. With the prominence that it would arise to as the final decider of laws. Article 4 talks about the relations between state and national government. We're going to talk about this a little bit when we talk about federalism and how federalism is the idea, remember our Legos, that federalism is levels of government. So in this case, what we will call the national government, even though we call that many different names, some good, some bad, and state governments, which we remember in this case are really little s states. But that's what Article 4 is about, is the role of federalism. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution. Now, the amendment to the Constitution is important. They knew they weren't creating something perfect from all time, which is why they built into its device a way to change something so that we also didn't have to throw it all out and begin again. We will talk about this in another unit. In fact, the next unit for our government class. 6 is that supremacy clause. It establishes in Article 6 that the national government is supreme. It also says that there's not going to be nobility, and it creates the oaths of office that we have to swear allegiance to the government. Number 7 is the ratification process. This is a departure. The Articles of Confederation required all states to agree to amendments or to any changes. Now, under the Constitutional Convention, it wasn't called that at the time, Rhode Island didn't even show up. They knew they weren't going to be able to do all 13. Plus, they didn't want one state to be able to hijack progressive or making positive changes to the government or things that needed to happen. So they built into this new document that you only needed 9 to ratify the Constitution out of the 13. Now, we ended up with all 13. It was iffy at times. New York, Virginia, those were the key ones, and they wanted changes, which is why we ended up with the Bill of Rights. But that's a story for another day. What I want you to do is you have that scavenger hunt. You also have the other assignments you could be working on. Take the remaining time to do that. This doesn't take as long initially because we don't have that feedback. So other lectures, hopefully I'll be answering questions from this one. Hopefully maybe they paused to allow you to write things down. Maybe they went back. Let me know what you need help with. I'll do a follow-up to explain something a little bit better if I can. Okay? Hang in there, guys. We'll see you on the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.